Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. What do you think when you hear these words? How do these words make you feel? I've mentioned in my homilies over the last couple of weeks that the Sermon on the Mount, of which today's gospel is a part, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus takes the Jewish law and he elevates it to a new level, to a higher level. He doesn't say, don't worry about it, and he doesn't say it's not relevant anymore. No, he raises it to another level. He takes it from exterior actions to an interior transformation, to a change of one's heart. And in today's gospel, he raises the bar as high as you can go. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. If you're like me, this seems maybe just a little daunting, or maybe just a little impossible. But Jesus knows what he's talking about. He would not ask the impossible of us. However, we do need to understand Jesus' words properly because we filter everything through the lens of our human experience, and that lens can often be a little distorted. So when we hear, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, I think it's easy to kind of dismiss it or tune it out or ignore it because it just doesn't seem realistic. When we think of being perfect, we tend to think in worldly terms and of all the work and effort we have to put into it. The idea of perfection sounds virtually unattainable and carries with it a lot of pressure. How many of you have felt pressure to be perfect? Perhaps at work, perhaps in your marriage. Perhaps you feel pressure to have the perfect body. Perhaps the need to have the perfect house, the perfect life. And the pressure comes from different sources, from society, from others, from ourselves. Every society develops its set of expectations for what constitutes the perfect life. There's the pressure to perform, to compete, to succeed, to fit in. And I think these pressures keep getting greater. There's a theologian and writer named Dr. Chap Clark who has explored this issue in a couple of books called Hurt and Hurt 2.0, specifically with regard to the impact of these pressures to succeed on teenagers. However, I think Dr. Clark's findings are applicable to many, if not most of us, on some level. The central theme that his studies led him to is this: our society has moved from one in which children and all human beings are seen as a precious gift in and of themselves to one in which the value of all human beings is based in large part not on who we are, but rather on what we're capable of doing or producing. And this matters because this is the world that we live in, and we're all influenced by this idea. And how our young people are affected by this is that in the process of growing up, they find themselves, whether they're aware of it or not, trying to discover answers to fundamental questions about identity, autonomy, and belonging. And all people ask themselves these questions. The difference is the answers that our society gives to these questions. So to the question of identity, they want to know, who am I? To the question of autonomy, they want to know, what power do I have in the world? And to the question of belonging, they want to know, does anyone even care? And does my life matter? As you can imagine, problems and pressures emerge from these questions when the answers to them come from our culture and our society. So to the question of who am I, the world answers, you are an athlete, you're a musician, you're an artist, you're a rebel, you're liberal, you're conservative, whatever label. And it also answers, you have to be smart, you have to be funny, you have to be cool, you have to be attractive, and so on. To the question of what power do I have in the world answers that your power comes from how well you did on your last test, or in your last game, or in your last project or assignment, on how much money you have, on how much you own, what university you attended, what kind of job you have. And to the question of, does anybody care and do I matter, the world's answer is, that depends on the value you bring to society and how much you can advance our society's interests. The problem with these answers, of course, is that they're not correct, either because they're deficient or incomplete, or because they're complete falsehoods. And they all have the effect of creating this pressure to be perfect in the eyes of the world. And then rather than bringing anyone a sense of satisfaction or happiness or peace, they produce anxiety, depression, a sense of hopelessness and apathy. Our world, our culture, and sometimes even we ourselves, as well-intentioned as we may be, are guilty of creating or fostering this push for superficial human perfection and the hurt that comes along with it. And this hurt within us can and does affect our relationship with God. If we hear the words of Jesus, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect," in the same way we hear the world's call to false perfection, then on a spiritual level we may also find ourselves overwhelmed with anxiety and hopelessness and apathy. We feel that achieving godlike perfection is a burden that sits squarely on our shoulders. We become all too aware of our failings and inadequacies. And then we might become overwhelmed and just give up altogether. So how are we to understand Jesus' call to us to be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect? Well, looking at the Greek word for perfect that is used here, the Greek word that Jesus uses, or that the evangelists use, is teleoi. And this word, in addition to meaning perfect, has a broader definition: brought to its end, brought to its fullness, brought to completion. In other words, Jesus calls us to be brought to completion in Him, to become who God created us to be. And this is something that we cannot do on our own. The good news is that we do not have to. Only God can bring us to perfection. Only God can bring us to fullness and completion. Only He can make us who He created us to be. Yes, we do have a role to play in this transformation. We're not mere passive observers, but the principal actor in this transformation is not us, but God. Our role is, first of all, to acknowledge that we can't do it on our own, that we need God to be perfect as He is, and also to acknowledge that the perfection that God calls us to is not like worldly perfection, which concerns itself only with passing things. And secondly, our role is to make ourselves open and disposed to receive God's love, who alone can transform us. And we do this by being in relationship with God through our daily prayer, through going to Mass on Sunday, receiving the sacraments on a regular basis, doing our best to follow Jesus' example and His teachings, and asking forgiveness when we fail to do so. So as Jesus tells us, the old saying, "an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," does not apply to us. In other words, we do not seek revenge when we've been wronged. Instead, we walk away. "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy" does not apply either. We should strive to love everyone, not just the people we find it easy to love, but also the annoying or angry or bitter people in our lives. We must pray for our enemies and for those who hurt us. We must not participate in the world's never-ending cycle of sin and retaliation. Jesus, in dying on the cross for us, gives us the perfect example of this, and it's through His death that the Lord can make us perfect. We will only be brought to perfection or completion. We will only become who God created us to be when we've passed from this life to the next, when we come face to face with God. So in the meantime, let us strive to open our hearts to Christ so that He can begin, or so that He can continue this transformation of making us perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect.